Hi there, my name is Floyd, and welcome to our channel. If you love gripping true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. Today's story will take you deep into the dark secrets of a seemingly perfect family. But first, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new story. In the quiet town of Mapleton, Colorado, no one could have predicted the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect family. But everything changed on the night of November 14th, 2022, when a terrified young woman made a 911 call, revealing a sinister plot that would tear her family apart. That woman was Ellen Harper, a 28-year-old who had grown increasingly worried about her mother, Martha Harper, and her new stepfather, Richard Blackwell. Mapleton, with its picturesque streets and friendly neighbors, was the last place anyone would expect a tragedy like this to unfold. Ellen loved her mother deeply. They had always been close, especially after her father passed away years earlier. But when Martha married Richard in August 2022, things changed. Richard was charming, too charming, Ellen thought. From the moment he entered their lives, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Martha, blinded by love, was smitten with Richard's wealth and charisma. To everyone else in town, Richard seemed like the perfect husband, but Ellen saw a different side. He was controlling. He subtly isolated Martha from her friends and, more importantly, from Ellen. Ellen's concerns grew with every passing day. She couldn't explain it, but she knew Richard was hiding something. Ellen's gut instinct told her to dig deeper, and when she did, what she found was chilling. Richard wasn't who he claimed to be. In fact, his past was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. She discovered that his previous family had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind unanswered questions. In early 2022, Richard Blackwell appeared in Mapleton, seemingly out of nowhere. He was everything the town admired, a successful real estate developer, with wealth and charm to match. His tall figure, sharp suits, and smooth-talking demeanor quickly made him a prominent figure. To the people of Mapleton, Richard seemed like a man who had it all. He moved into a lavish home on the edge of town, driving expensive cars and throwing elegant parties. It wasn't long before Martha Harper, a beloved schoolteacher and widow, caught his eye. Their relationship moved fast. By the spring of 2022, the two were inseparable, and Richard's attention toward Martha seemed like a fairy tale romance. The town buzzed with excitement when Richard proposed, and their grand wedding in August was the event of the season. Guests marveled at Richard's generosity and Martha's newfound happiness. But Ellen Harper wasn't as enchanted. As soon as Richard entered their lives, she noticed subtle changes. At first it was little things, Richard suggesting Martha spend more time with him and less with Ellen. Then it became clear that he was quietly controlling Martha's social life, even deciding who she could and couldn't see. Ellen felt her mother slipping away, and every conversation with Richard only heightened her discomfort. Ellen's instincts told her something wasn't right. She tried talking to her mother, but Martha brushed off her concerns, calling Ellen paranoid and overprotective. "Richard only wants the best for me," Martha would say, dismissing any idea that her new husband could have ulterior motives. Despite Martha's assurances, Ellen's unease grew. One evening, she confided in her closest friend. "There's something off about him. He's too perfect, like it's an act," she explained, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's like he's playing a role and my mom can't see it." As the weeks passed, Richard's behavior became more concerning. He began dictating every aspect of Martha's life. Ellen's calls to her mother were often ignored or cut short, with Richard always nearby, monitoring their conversations. Ellen started to feel completely shut out. Then, she noticed inconsistencies in Richard's past. Casual comments about his previous life didn't add up. Ellen knew she had to take action before it was too late. If Richard wasn't the man he claimed to be, what exactly was he hiding? Ellen Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Richard. After weeks of seeing her mother becoming more and more isolated, Ellen decided it was time to dig deeper into her new stepfather's past. The polite smiles and perfect charm couldn't hide what her instincts were screaming. Richard Blackwell was not the man he appeared to be. It started with a simple online search. Richard had shared little about his life before Mapleton. He mentioned a brief stint in real estate development in a different state, vague details about old business partners, and claimed he had never been married. But Ellen noticed small things. He avoided certain topics and became defensive whenever his past came up. When Ellen searched Richard's name in public records, nothing showed up before 2020. It was as if Richard Blackwell had appeared out of nowhere just 2 years ago. Her frustration only fueled her determination. She spent late nights searching through different databases, records, and forums, trying every avenue she could think of. Then, she found a breakthrough. Richard Blackwell wasn't his real name. In 2020, he had legally changed his name from Arthur Langston, a man whose last known residence was in a small town in Nevada. It was in Nevada that things started to get darker. Ellen discovered news articles from 2019 about a woman named Clara Hartwell, who had been married to Arthur Langston. Clara and their 2 young children had gone missing without a trace, leaving behind a series of strange circumstances and unanswered questions. Authorities had been investigating, but Arthur had disappeared shortly after his family did, and the case eventually went cold. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, only the mystery of a missing family and a husband who vanished soon after. Ellen's heart raced as she read through the details. Could this Arthur Langston be her stepfather, Richard? The dates matched. The descriptions, while vague, seemed too close to be a coincidence. Her stomach turned as she realized the gravity of what she had found. Richard, or Arthur, had already left one family behind, one that had never been found. The more she uncovered, the more she began to fear for her mother's safety. Richard's charm had masked something far more sinister, a man with a hidden past and possibly a dangerous future. Ellen's sleepless nights of research paid off when she uncovered even more unsettling details. Arthur Langston had been questioned by Nevada police after his family's disappearance, but due to a lack of concrete evidence, he was never charged. Investigators had no leads, and with Arthur's sudden departure, the case had grown cold. As Ellen pieced together these dark fragments, one horrifying thought consumed her. Her mother could be in danger. This wasn't just about a man with secrets. It was about a man who may have harmed his own family, and now that man was living under the same roof as her mother. Confrontation with her mother. Ellen knew she had to tell her mother, but the thought of confronting Martha about this weighed heavily on her. How could she convince her mother that the man she had fallen in love with was potentially a murderer? One cold night in late October 2022, Ellen finally gathered the courage to confront Martha. She drove to her mother's house, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, her mind racing. What if Martha refused to believe her? What if this conversation pushed her mother further into Richard's control? As soon as Ellen entered the house, she could sense the tension. Richard wasn't home, but the air felt thick, as if his presence lingered even in his absence. Ellen sat her mother down in the living room, her heart pounding. "Mom, we need to talk about Richard," Ellen began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Martha, ever the optimist, smiled warmly. "What's there to talk about, Ellen? Richard's been wonderful to me." Ellen felt a lump forming in her throat but pressed on. "Mom, he's not who he says he is. I've done some digging. His real name is Arthur Langston, and he had another family before you." The smile faded from Martha's face, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about? Ellen, that's ridiculous. Richard would have told me if he'd been married before. He's been nothing but honest with me." Ellen's desperation grew. "No, Mom, you don't understand. His previous wife, Clara, and their kids, they went missing. No one knows what happened to them. He disappeared right after, changed his name, and now he's here with you. You're in danger." Martha's eyes widened, but instead of fear, Ellen saw something she hadn't expected: disbelief and even anger. "Ellen, stop this. I know you've had doubts about Richard from the beginning, but this is too much. You've gone too far." Ellen was stunned. "Mom, I'm trying to protect you. Please, just look at the evidence I've found. You can't ignore this." But Martha shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You've always been so protective. But this is paranoia, Ellen. Richard loves me, and I love him. You have to stop this." The conversation went nowhere. Ellen felt like she was speaking to a wall. Her mother, blinded by love and Richard's manipulative charm, refused to even consider the possibility that she might be in danger. Ellen left the house that night more frightened than ever. Her mother was trapped in Richard's web, and there was nothing she could do to pull her out. But Ellen knew one thing for certain: she couldn't give up. Richard's past wasn't just going to stay in the shadows forever. Ellen's worst fears were about to come true, and the events that followed would change her life forever. On the night of November 14th, 2022, everything came crashing down. The tension that had been building for months finally reached its breaking point, and Ellen Harper's worst fears came true in the most horrifying way. It started like any other night. Ellen was at home, still reeling from the confrontation with her mother. Days had passed, but she couldn't shake the ominous feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She hadn't spoken to Martha since their argument, and Richard had made sure to cut off all communication. Ellen's calls went unanswered, and her texts were ignored. She feared she had pushed her mother too far, but deep down, she knew she couldn't have stayed silent. Around 11:30 p.m., Ellen's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened it with trembling hands. The message simply read, "You were right, help me." It was from her mother, Martha. Ellen's heart dropped. Her mother was in danger, and time was running out. Without hesitating, she grabbed her keys and raced to her car, speeding through the quiet streets of Mapleton. The drive to her mother's house felt like an eternity. She could barely think straight, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. When she arrived at the house, something was wrong. The lights were off, and the front door was slightly ajar. The air was cold and still, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Ellen's stomach churned. She rushed to the door, calling out for her mother. "Mom! Mom, are you here?" Her voice echoed through the house, but there was no response. She stepped inside, and that's when she saw it, the scene that would haunt her forever. Martha Harper was lying on the living room floor, motionless, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. She had been shot, the wound visible on her chest. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "No, no, no," she whispered as tears blurred her vision. As the room around her seemed frozen in time. The once cozy home was now a crime scene, with shards of broken glass on the floor near the window and a shattered vase knocked over during what seemed like a struggle. But Richard was nowhere to be found. Ellen's mind raced. She had to act fast. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Please send help. My mother, she's been shot. I think my stepfather did this. He's gone." The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Ellen could barely focus. She followed the instructions, checking her mother for any signs of life. But it was too late. Martha was gone. Ellen knelt by her mother's side, sobbing, her body shaking with grief and shock. The police arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights flashed outside and officers flooded into the house, securing the scene. Ellen sat numbly on the front steps as they questioned her, but her mind was somewhere else. She couldn't shake the image of her mother's lifeless body. She had known something like this would happen, and yet she had been powerless to stop it. Detective Serena Marshall was among the first on the scene. A no-nonsense investigator with years of experience, she took immediate control of the situation. After getting Ellen's statement, she turned her attention to the house. There were clear signs of a struggle, but Richard had disappeared without a trace. The investigation began swiftly. Officers combed through the house for any clues as to where Richard had gone, while forensic teams gathered evidence. It didn't take long for them to confirm what Ellen already knew. Richard had fled, leaving Martha dead in his wake. Detective Marshall was methodical. She quickly pieced together the situation based on Ellen's information and the crime scene. A gun was missing from the house, and there were clear signs that Richard had planned his escape. It was a shocking crime, even for someone as seasoned as Detective Marshall. By the time the coroner arrived to take Martha's body, Ellen was nearly inconsolable. She sat outside, her hands clenched tightly together, staring at the ground. The weight of guilt pressed down on her. If only she had convinced her mother sooner, if only she had been more persistent. Now it was too late. As the night wore on, the police put out an APB for Richard Blackwell, now the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. The entire town of Mapleton was on edge. The manhunt for Richard began immediately, but with no leads and a 2-hour head start, the chances of finding him quickly were slim. Ellen remained at the crime scene, surrounded by officers and detectives, but feeling utterly alone. The realization that Richard could still be out there, hiding somewhere in the shadows, sent chills down her spine. The man who had killed her mother was now on the run, and Ellen knew he wasn't going to stop until he was far, far away. But Richard's escape wasn't going to be easy. The hunt for him was just beginning, and soon, secrets from his past would come to light. Secrets that would make Ellen's discovery look like just the tip of the iceberg. With Richard Blackwell now a fugitive, the peaceful town of Mapleton was gripped by fear. The police immediately launched an intense manhunt, determined to bring the man responsible for Martha Harper's murder to justice. Detective Serena Marshall took charge, coordinating search teams, roadblocks, and issuing a statewide all-points bulletin for Richard. The clock was ticking, and every moment Richard remained free, the danger increased. The next day, November 15th, 2022, authorities located Richard's abandoned SUV on a secluded road near the edge of the Rocky Mountains, about 30 miles from Mapleton. It was the first real lead. Inside the car, they found traces of blood, a discarded cell phone, and Richard's wallet, but the man himself had vanished. The blood suggested he had been injured, possibly during his escape, but how badly was unclear. There was no weapon inside the vehicle, meaning Richard was still armed and dangerous. A sense of urgency swept through the town and surrounding areas. Search parties, aided by helicopters and trained dogs, scoured the dense forests and rugged mountain terrain. The cold November air made the search even more difficult. Richard could be hiding anywhere, and the woods provided plenty of places to disappear. The news of Richard's disappearance hit Mapleton hard. Rumors spread quickly through the town, with many fearing that Richard, or Arthur Langston as Ellen had discovered, might be lurking nearby, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Local media began covering the story, flashing Richard's face across every screen. People who had once welcomed him into their community now couldn't believe the monster hiding beneath the surface. Despite the growing tension, Detective Marshall remained focused. She reviewed every piece of evidence from the crime scene, carefully considering Richard's past and trying to predict his next move. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The disappearance of Richard's first wife and children in Nevada raised immediate red flags. It became clear that Martha's murder might not have been Richard's first crime, just the most recent in a long line of tragedies. Back in Mapleton, Ellen Harper struggled with the emotional toll of her mother's death. She couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of that awful night. The guilt weighed on her heavily. She had tried to warn her mother, and now she was left wondering if she could have done more. But one thing was clear. Richard's escape wasn't over yet, and Ellen couldn't rest until he was found. As police traced his previous movements and began to unravel his past, a disturbing revelation came to light. Investigators found a cabin in the mountains that had been rented under an alias tied to Richard, an alias connected to his former life as Arthur Langston. The cabin was remote, isolated, and perfect for hiding. When law enforcement arrived, the door was ajar, and inside, they found more clues that linked Richard to the mysterious disappearance of his first family. The cabin itself was eerie, filled with old documents, photographs, and even items belonging to Clara Hartwell and their children. It became clear that Richard had been living a double life long before he ever set foot in Mapleton. What was more unsettling was the discovery of a letter written by Clara shortly before her disappearance. In it, she expressed fear for her life, hinting that she knew Arthur was capable of something terrible. Detective Marshall now had enough evidence to suggest that Richard had been responsible for his previous family's disappearance, adding even more urgency to his capture. Richard wasn't just a man on the run, he was a man with a history of vanishing when things got dangerous. But this time, Richard wasn't going to vanish without a fight. As the search continued, tensions mounted, and the final confrontation between law enforcement and Richard would prove to be as deadly as it was inevitable. The search for Richard Blackwell reached its climax on November 22, 2022, exactly 1 week after the murder of Martha Harper. Detective Serena Marshall and her team had tracked his movements to a remote canyon deep in the Rocky Mountains, following a tip from a park ranger who had spotted someone matching Richard's description. As night fell, the air was cold, and the canyon's jagged cliffs loomed ominously in the darkness. Armed officers and search dogs combed through the rough terrain, while helicopters circled above, their searchlights piercing through the trees. Richard was desperate, injured, and on the run, but the police knew he was cornered. There was nowhere left for him to go. Around 9:15 p.m., a sharp whistle came from one of the search dogs, signaling movement nearby. The officers closed in, and soon enough they found Richard, huddled near the edge of a cliff, his face pale and gaunt, a gun clutched tightly in his hand. He had been living in the wilderness for days, evading capture, but he was at the end of his rope. Detective Marshall approached cautiously, her voice steady but firm. "Richard, it's over. There's nowhere left to run. Put the gun down and surrender." Richard didn't move. His eyes darted from side to side, scanning the cliffs around him as if he were still looking for an escape. His breathing was labored, his injuries from the previous days clearly taking a toll. In a last, desperate attempt to avoid capture, Richard raised the gun, pointing it toward the officers. But before he could act, shots rang out. The police fired, hitting Richard in the shoulder. The impact knocked him backward, and in one horrifying moment, he stumbled toward the edge of the cliff. Before anyone could reach him, Richard fell, disappearing into the darkness below. The officers rushed to the edge, shining their flashlights into the canyon, but all they could see was the rushing river at the bottom. There was no sign of Richard. He had fallen into the freezing water, swept away by the powerful current. Despite an extensive search over the next few days, no body was ever recovered. Authorities believed Richard Blackwell had died that night, his body likely carried away by the river, but without proof, doubts lingered. Could Richard have survived yet again? Even in death, or presumed death, Richard's shadow loomed over the town, and Ellen was left to grapple with the unsettling possibility that her mother's killer might still be out there, waiting for another chance to disappear. The presumed death of Richard Blackwell, or Arthur Langston, left the town of Mapleton in shock. Though the police believed he had drowned in the river, the absence of a body left an unsettling feeling of incompletion. Once a peaceful community, Mapleton now lived under the shadow of Richard's terrifying legacy, a man who deceived them all, took a life, and disappeared without a trace. For Ellen Harper, the aftermath of her mother's murder was filled with grief and guilt. She had tried to stop it, tried to warn her mother, but it hadn't been enough. Now she faced the tormenting reality that the man who tore her family apart might still be out there. Each phone call or knock at the door made her heart race, fearing Richard's possible return. Just days after Richard's disappearance, the town gathered to honor Martha Harper's memory. Friends and family attended the somber memorial, mourning the loss of a kind woman caught in the web of a dangerous man. Ellen stood tearfully at the front, speaking of her mother's love, wishing things had turned out differently. Detective Serena Marshall, while officially winding down the investigation, remained cautious. Without a body, closure felt elusive. She continued to search for Richard's remains, ensuring his name stayed on law enforcement's radar in surrounding states. As weeks passed, hope for resolution faded. The media moved on, and Mapleton tried to return to normal, but the memory of what had happened lingered. The town had learned that monsters could hide in plain sight. Ellen Harper, left with the painful memories of that November night, knew her life would never be the same. Though Richard Blackwell was presumed dead, the town of Mapleton would never forget the man who tore a family apart and vanished without a trace. And that brings us to the end of today's chilling story. What do you think? Do you believe Richard Blackwell or Arthur Langston really died in that river, or is he still out there somewhere, hiding in plain sight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story intriguing, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more gripping true crime content just like this. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when a new story drops. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are right in front of us.